Hi, everybody, and good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Professor Puleng Sakalo, and I'm really looking forward to having a chat with you today regarding selecting your methodology. So you have your research topic, you have a question that you're asking, but all of those do not happen in isolation. It's also very important to think about how they link to your methodology or how the methodology that you'll end up choosing also links or connects to the research question that you are asking. So today and the next coming days, we're going to be looking at selecting your methodology, and we're going to specifically be looking at qualitative research methods. What does it entail? What does it involve? How do you bring it into your research work? And what are the different designs within research methodologies that are qualitative? So all of these are very important for you to think about as you decide on what methodology is relevant for your studies. So I'm going to share my presentation for us. And then I'm just going to let us focus on the presentation. Okay, so as I was saying, we're going to be focusing on selecting your methodology and your research design. And we're going to start today. Okay, if my presentation can move. So the first thing that I would like you to think about, or what I would like us to discuss, is the issue of paradigms. So in research, we speak about paradigms, and there are different paradigms that we draw upon, that we follow when we're conducting research. So there has to be something that informs how you're going to conduct your research. Methodology is very important because it is really the core of your research. This is where you're going to be collecting your data. This is where you're going to be analyzing. This is where you're going to be making interpretations. This is where you're going to come up with recommendations and conclusions based on the data that you would have collected. So before you even get to all of that, how do you decide? How do you get to saying, this is how I'm going to be doing my research? It's not something that you need to say, okay, I prefer qualitative or I prefer quantitative. It has to be based on something. It can be your preference because that's something you're comfortable with, but what is the basis of it? And this is where we need to start before we can even get to the different methodologies that you would like to do. And this is where paradigms then become very useful, right? So paradigms assist us to be able to think about the way in which we view the world, the way in which we come into the world, influences how we make meaning of the world, influences how we ask the questions that we're asking. You know, when you're looking for a supervisor and you identify people and you get the question, so what is it that you're interested in? Why this particular topic? Why are you asking this question? And as we often say, why should people care about the question that you're asking, right? Why is it important for us to spend 2 years together, 3 years together, 4 years together, working on answering this particular question, right? So it's very important that the basis of it, the genesis of it, is very well grounded, because when you have that firm grounding, then it somewhat becomes easier for you or for the next steps to be able to follow. So paradigms are about how you view reality, what is viewed as knowledge and viewed as truth, right? So when we're thinking about scientific knowledge production, it's the kind of knowledge that is based on empirical studies, empirical engagement, where there is a basis for the conclusion that you come up with. So how do you view the world? And this is why when we had our last session speaking about the importance of decolonization, indigenization, Africanization, saying that where you come from, your context, your background, your cosmology, all of those things play a very critical role in how you perceive the world, in how you understand knowledge to be. And that is why sometimes then when you come to university and the way in which you were raised or understood the world to be sometimes gets questioned or challenged. And you now have to think and decide, okay, how do I now look at the world or think about the world differently? Or how do I add this way of knowing or being that I'm being introduced to what I already know? And sadly, what often happens is that there's almost this assumed expectation that what you already know when you come in is not valid. So you're coming here to learn. You're coming here as if you are an empty vessel as a student. And that is why then when you draw or take on the decolonial agenda, it then says, but there are all these histories, there are all these other knowledges that also exist. And so how do you bring these knowledges into conversation with each other? How do you bring these knowledges into the question that you ask for your research, right? So what is viewed as knowledge? What is viewed as the truth? And who determines what truth is? And philosophically speaking or ideologically speaking, these are things that are very important for you as a student to think about. And often we don't give much attention to the ways in which we view reality, the ways in which we think about knowledge or what is deemed as truth is not integral or is not often looked at as an integral part of your research journey, of the project that you're working on as a researcher. And when you do that, when you start from this standpoint, it becomes useful even as you start sitting with your data to say, how do I make meaning of this data? This grounding assists you to be able to do that work, right? And so hence we're saying that the method that you then choose for your research is dependent on these, is dependent on your view of reality, of knowledge, of truth. So that will lead to what you then privilege in terms of how you engage with the world around you. Okay, so how do we then look at this? How do these show themselves? We often speak about ontology, we speak about epistemology, and often we don't take them as integral to the work that we're doing. So for example, ontology. Ontology is the theory of existence. It is the nature of reality. What is real? What is not real? What is truth? What is not truth? What counts? You know, when we go back to how the colonial project inserted itself in the various parts of the world, it was also about ontology. What is perceived as real? What is perceived as knowledge or real knowledge? And on the other hand, what is perceived as superstition, right? What is perceived as something that is not founded on real knowledge? And that is what ontology is. It's a sense of being. And for a very long time, certain parts of the world or certain people in certain parts of the world were deemed as being people without knowledge, people without history. And therefore, their view of reality was deemed suspect. And that's why it was deemed important to civilize. So when you think about this project of civilization, the whole idea of civilization is on the basis that there is a world or a space that is not civilized. There are people that are not civilized, and therefore those who are deemed to be civilized have the authority to civilize others, right? And by so doing, it denies the ontology of other people. It denies their sense of being. And that's why many of people's histories, particularly people from the formerly colonized parts of the world, were seen as people without history, right? And as you think about your work, you need to think about this as well, that I want to answer a particular question. I want to respond to a particular problem. But what is the basis of that problem that you're seeking to answer? Always say, look at the root and not just the symptoms, right? You're saying you're doing a study where you want to alleviate poverty, or you want to come up with a solution that can assist and contribute towards alleviation of poverty. It should not just be about you wanting to contribute or make sure that we reach our sustainable development goals. But you need to say, but why do we have the problem of poverty in the first place? And this is where the importance of history, the importance of inequality, and the importance again of the lack of justice when it comes to resource allocation or access to resources become very important, right? And this is what ontology assists us to be able to do. That why is it that certain regions of the world or certain people in the world are the ones that are experiencing poverty more? So what is the root of that? So don't just look at the symptoms and saying that we are experiencing high levels of poverty, and because of poverty, some children cannot afford to go to school or concentrated school because they are hungry. That is important. That is a legitimate issue. And that is something that requires attention. But when you do that, are you fundamentally responding to the bigger issue of why we have poverty in the first place? Because you don't want to, again, come up with a solution that is just very time specific, but you want to say, what are some of the things that we need to consider if we want to see a world, right? When you think about Africa and Agenda 2063, for example, which is still far off, but not even that far, and say, can we anticipate a world where we eradicate poverty? And how is my research possibly going to contribute towards that agenda? And then epistemology, how do we know the world? Epistemology is the theory of knowledge. It's about what counts as knowledge and what does not count as knowledge. How we learn and how we think about the nature of truth. And again, we need to think about epistemology in its plural sense, that there are multiple epistemologies that are there in the world. Many of the decolonial scholars have warned us that for a very long time, we've suffered what they call epistemic erasure, right? Or epistemic violence, where other ways of knowing or other ways of being in the world have been relegated to the margins. Or as I just said, that they are sometimes other ways of knowing or being are seen as just superstitions and not actually things that form part of people's cosmologies and how they make sense of the world. How do people know the world, right? How do indigenous people or the Inuit people in North America make sense of the world? So what is their epistemology? And based on their history, based on their environment, based on over generations, knowledge that has been passed on from one generation to another, all of those things combine. Give people, provide people with a way in which they can view the world. we are struggling right now with a lot of challenges, right? One of them being climate change, a shift in the environment, and now with the climate and the temperatures shifting, and we're seeing that we don't really know when it's winter, when it's summer, when it's the rainy season, because in the middle of winter it just rains, even in areas where you would not expect that, right? And this is again as a result of our relationship with nature and how we've disrespected nature. And you go into communities that revere, understand, and respect nature. And as a result, knowing how they are interconnected with nature. And that realization and understanding, that epistemology, provides them with a lens with which they move in the world and how they engage with the environment. And then on the other hand, you think about a world where we want to produce, where we want profit, right? Those of you who are in the economic and management sciences can think about this in terms of how you ask your questions about accumulation and about profit and about capital and what those mean in the context of wanting to protect the environment, right? So how do these various epistemologies assist us to make meaning of the world and to also think about the questions that we ask when we're doing our research? And when you've now contemplated on these things, then you can move to saying, okay, how do I then think about a methodology that is going to assist me to gain knowledge in the way that is aligned to how I want to understand the world or how I understand the world, right? And so that's the theory of method. The method that you choose has to be informed about or informed by the ontology, by the epistemology with which you draw from, with which you make meaning of the world. Okay. All right. So one of the paradigms that we have is positivist paradigm, right? And positivist paradigm has been a paradigm that has been privileged for a very long time. And it is a paradigm that says science looks a particular way. And if you do not do work or research in a particular way, then what you are doing cannot be considered as scientific or as scholarly, right? And so it's one ontology. This ontology is about how you perceive reality, as we've just discussed. And from a positivist paradigm, there is one scientific real reality. It can be measured, it can be predicted, and you can move from A to B. If you account for various variables, then this is the definite conclusion that you can come up with, right? So you see how things correlate, you look at the relationships between variables, and you measure specifically in a particular predetermined way. And the idea is that you are searching for certainty. You want to say with, yes.
Sorry, your presentation is not showing.
On my side, it says I'm sharing.
Is it? I'm not sure. Let me see.
What do I need to be doing?
Okay, now it's showing.
Now it's showing.
Yes, okay, thank you. Great.
All right, all right. Okay, what was that? Okay, I'll move from this side then, from here. Okay, so where was I? Yeah, so I was talking about how positivist paradigm requires of you to search for certainty. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, because when you attend other sessions that focus on quantitative research methodologies, these are some of the things that you would then attend to. I want to spend time focusing on qualitative methods, but I think it's important for us to understand all of these different paradigms in totality, because I think when we understand one without the other, that is where, again, we tend to have misunderstandings and misconceptions in terms of what counts as knowledge, what doesn't, and which one is better and which one isn't. But to understand that each one has got its space and its place. And what becomes a challenge is the assumption that one is superior to the other. Okay. And then in terms of epistemology, when you're drawing from positivist paradigm, you're looking at knowledge, reality, and truth, and how you come to what counts as knowledge, reality, and truth. And here, as I was saying, it's about things that can be predicted. It's about seeking certainty. So it's about knowable facts, right? It's the cause and effect, things that you can measure, and knowing that if you do this, this is going to be what the result is going to be. This causes that, and this happens as a result of that. So there's this causal effect that can be measured, that can be determined. So it's more like there are underlying regularities. So it's a determined law on how things should be. At the end of the day, you want something that can be generalizable. You want something that can be deemed as the truth. You want something that is objective. So you as the researcher need to be able to remove yourself from whatever findings that you're going to come up with. So it's about absolute knowledge. And as I said, the methodologies that you would use for you, if how you view reality and your understanding of it and how you approach things is from a positivist paradigm, then you would do quantitative research, experimental research, where you do predictive studies, where you do controlled studies, where you want to do studies where you can generalize, where things can be tested, right? So that's what you would do. Whereas on the other side of it, another paradigm, which is what we're going to then be focusing on for the next coming days, is the constructivist or interpretivist paradigm. And what is this paradigm? This paradigm is about understanding reality in its multiple forms, right? That reality is understood from a subjective position, where what happens in the world or how we view the world is constructed, and how we interpret the world is also based on the history, is based on the politics, is based on the economy, is based on the cultures, is based on our engagements and interaction with one another, is based on our engagements and interaction with the environment. So all of these things are constructed. And how these constructions then happen is that through how we construct the world, we then give meaning to the world. And our understanding, therefore, of reality and truth from a constructivist and interpretivist paradigm is that we understand events through interpretation. What am I seeing here? And what does this mean? What does what I'm seeing mean? What influences this? How is the context influencing what I'm seeing? Would I still see the same thing if I were to move to a different context, right? And so you can already see that it therefore becomes difficult for you to come up with a universal understanding of phenomena. So phenomena is influenced by the context, by the interactions, by the experiences that people have that would then be how knowledge becomes produced, how knowledge comes to be. So how you then collect your data will be determined by the epistemology and the ontology that you are drawing from. And the methodologies for this is that you will then use a qualitative method where you draw from case studies, for example, and then using this to understand and interpret particular context, as I've just indicated. And then from this the constructivist paradigm, interpretive paradigm, we then move further to saying, how do we even go deeper in terms of underlying meanings and how these interact with the context wherein people live? Is when you're now saying, how do I look at the world from a critical lens, critical perspective? And how do I also do that in such a way so you don't just want to interpret, you're also saying, how do I imagine a world or do research that is emancipatory, right? So you're thinking about emancipation, you're thinking about how this research has also got emancipation possibilities to it. So this is another paradigm then that you can draw from. And here you're saying the history, the social context, the political context, the economic values of people, how people are in society, but also, again, very important, which is often not integral when you're looking at constructivism, is also the role of power, power relations, access to power, and what that can do in determining reality, right? So those who've got access to power, and those who are in power play a very critical role in determining what reality looks like or what realities could look like. Okay, so if you think, for example, that before 94, many years ago in South Africa, LGBTQI plus community was deemed as criminal, was deemed as immoral, was deemed as, a crime that you could not be, right? You could not just come out and say, I am a homosexual person, for example, that because of the structural powers, because of the government decisions, right? So the role of power in determining what your reality or what people's reality could or should be. So you have to now live in a world where reality is predetermined in a particular way. That if you are imagining a reality differently, that might actually get you into trouble, right? And this is where then emancipatory paradigm then comes in, is to really chip on these unequal power dynamics that exist in the world. And when you do that, then you also even rethink the ways in which you look at what counts as knowledge and what doesn't. Because some of the laws and some of the decisions that were made were actually based on knowledge, right? On what was determined as the truth. So now when you draw from an emancipatory paradigm, you're saying, we need to rethink epistemologies. Right? So you're critiquing the ideologies that are prevailing, that are privileged. And you're saying, but how people come into the world and present themselves in the world cannot and should not just be predetermined in the way that it has been. And obviously here, there's a lot of controversial things or ways in which we would have conversations or you conduct your research. There's a lot of, it's argumentative because you need to make an argument for a particular way of being, right? Why do people who identify as LGBTIQ plus also deserve to be treated and offered the same liberties and equalities and rights that everybody has? So you need to make an argument for why that should be. right? And when we think about controversial, for example, we say, okay, if I'm looking at the laws of abortion, where you know that depending on where you're coming from, if maybe you're coming from a particular sector of Christianity or religion more broadly, that might be something that is frowned upon. And we also know the power that many of our religious institutions also have as well. So you need to come to your research with a very critical lens in this sense, because at the end of the day, it's the kind of research that aims or looks specifically, the main intention, even at the beginning, as you ask your question, as you say, this is my research question, this is the objective of my research, embedded in your objective is the issue of social justice, is the issue of emancipation, right? Where you're interested in issues of oppression, like gender justice, racial justice, sexual justice. So all these things that have been deemed as injustices in the world would be the kind of research that you're interested in. And then you will draw also from discourse analysis, and you will draw, for example, from critical action research, and much of the feminist work that is done would fall under this paradigm, critical emancipatory paradigm. And we'll engage on how these then look like when you're actually doing your research, and how you think about even data collection and how you choose your research design. So for a very long time, as I was saying, quantitative was the privileged form of paradigm, knowledge production. And obviously, as researchers, as scholars, or as scholars in the making, one of the things that's important that you need to know is that knowledge always evolves, right? The world evolves, the challenges, the issues that are confronting us always evolve. The reason why you're doing your master or your doctoral studies is because you want to contribute to your discipline, you want to see it going forward, you want to contribute to your discipline and to knowledge production, so that we can start thinking differently about things that are there in the world. Many of the innovations that we have are based on the cracks or lack or things that we see in the world that require solutions, that require answers, right? And therefore, this was a debate again among researchers but quantitative is not and cannot be sufficient for the kinds of questions that we have in the world. And therefore, there are gaps in terms of what we can do research on, or how we are doing research, and the questions that we are answering, if we only privilege one way of understanding the world, if we only privilege one ontology or epistemology and assume a universality in how we understand the world. So what is important for us to consider is that even as we're looking at these various paradigms, it's important to note that both have value, right? Qualitative plays a particular role, again, depending on the ontology and epistemology that you're using, depending on the question that you want to answer. Does it make sense for you to answer it using qualitative or quantitative, right? So they both have value. They both have different strengths and different weaknesses, right? What is it that you want to achieve has to determine how you then are going to go about doing your research. So they have to each be judged based on their own criteria. What is it that qualitative research aims to do, aims to accomplish? And on the other side, again, what is it that quantitative research aims to do and accomplish? So again, all of these things facilitated the development of the last paradigm, right? And this last paradigm is called pragmatism, right? It says, look at the usefulness of what it is that you want to achieve, but also how about we use different paradigms alongside each other, different ways of collecting data or methodologies that we can use alongside each other. And I know there are many colleagues who actually prefer mixed methods because mixed methods almost gives you a midpoint, if you will, where you can say, okay, I'm interested in this, but I'm also interested in this. So for me to be able to do this research, I'm going to use both quantitative and qualitative. So you can use qualitative or use quantitative or use both. Again, this has to be determined by what it is that you want to achieve with your research. Right? When you use mixed methods, then they supplement each other. You don't use them for the sake of using them or for the sake of saying no. Then my study or my research is all encompassing. You need to be able to justify why you're using a particular paradigm at any given point anyway, right? So again, just in a nutshell, where are the differences that we see? How do we then determine between each? Again, as I said, depending on the focus of your study and your research, the focus of qualitative, again, is about experience. You're interested in experiences of people if you are doing your research on individuals or groups, right? It's about the experience. It's about interviewing, doing a focus groups, a case study. So it could be one person, it could be 5 people, it could be 10 people, it could be 20 people. Again, it depends on what it is that you want to achieve. That's why even when we get to data collection, the question often asked is around issues of sample. How do you know that you've got enough? What number is acceptable, is okay? So you cannot just say 50 interviews or 20 interviews or 5 interviews. Again, it has to be determined by what it is that you want to achieve with that research, right? And this is very different than in quantitative, where quantity plays a very critical role. Again, it's about the frequency, which also then tells you which direction your results are going and also how you can come to your conclusions, right? So it's not about experience, but it's about the quantity. How many people say this? What is the frequency of the answers that I'm getting? What is the magnitude of the issue, the problem, the phenomenon, right? So 70 out of 200 people said this. Okay, what does that tell me? 200 out of 800 people said this. What does this tell us about the way in which people see this particular phenomena? And then the philosophical roots. As I said, it's constructivism, it's interpretism. You want to interpret people's experiences. You want to understand how people construct reality, right? What is the experience of a particular reality? How do they interpret the world? And then, of course, in quantitative, it's positivism. You want to measure, you want to count, right? And then again, you want to understand. When you understand, you are able to describe. When you describe, you're able to provide and offer meaning so that we can get a better understanding of why certain things happen or why certain things happen in the way that they do. Right? We want to understand and have meaning of reality. Why is it that we've got such a huge challenge of femicide in South Africa, right? Why is it that so many women are being killed in South Africa? So you want to have an understanding of that. You want to be able to give meaning, to say these are some of the underlying issues and underlying reasons why South Africa experiences this. Is it related to this? Is it related to that? What is going on, right? So you want to get that understanding. And in quantitative, it's about prediction. You want to predict. This is where we are in South Africa right now, right? That so many women out of so many get raped every day, right? And what can we predict? That if things continue to happen the way that they do, then it means 10 years from now, this is what's going to be happening. If 1 in 5 women get killed daily, what does that mean if the status quo remain? 5 years from now, what would it mean for the South African society? So now you want to predict, right? And that's where quantitative comes in. You want to be able to control. You want to be able to say, okay, if we see that if this persists, in 10 years, this is what's going to be happening. So therefore, what needs to be put in place? What recommendations, what solutions need to be in place for us to be able to curb this challenge, for us to ensure that in 10 years, we do not have the same challenge as we're having right now, right? So that's where, depending on the focus of your research, again, you can test, you can confirm, you can be able to predict, right? Whether you're doing clinical trials, whether you're doing experiments, whether you want to look at our access to water or clean water, what is it that needs to happen to ensure that we do not run out of clean water, right? So again, the focus of your research will determine all of these things. And qualitative is flexible, it's evolving, and things are emergent. So you might be interviewing 10 people, but as you are busy with your interviews and engaging, as you probe, you might find that, okay, this question is redundant. I keep getting the same answer, or it keeps being misunderstood. Maybe I need to rethink, right? Or as you're busy with the interviews, you'll find that people actually want to dwell more on something else pertaining to the issue, but maybe on something else that was not your predetermined idea in terms of what you thought the main focus was going to be. So there is that flexibility with qualitative research. Whereas in quantitative, it's very structured and predetermined. So for example, if somebody comes to you with a survey, with a questionnaire, and they've got 20 questions in that questionnaire, you're going to answer those questions as they are in that questionnaire. You're going to tick on a Likert scale, for example, between 1 and 5, what is the, the highest, what would you say is the reason why we have femicide, right? So you have those 5 predetermined even answers for you. So you can't look at the 5 answers and say, no, I want to change 1, right? So it's predetermined because the whole study and the hypothesis that was put forward was on the basis, or the questionnaire was on the basis of the hypothesis that was already made and that was put up. And so you cannot sit with a questionnaire and scratch out questions and put in your own questions because you think they should have asked the question differently, which is something that you kind of have some room to do and negotiate in qualitative, because it's about conversation and engagement. So you as the researcher are the instrument, or is the instrument in qualitative research, whereas in quantitative, there's an external instrument. As I said, you use a survey, it's predetermined. Sometimes you even give to people and you submit to many people all at the same time and they answer, and then you sit with the feedback after the fact. So it's not like you can go back. And most of the time when we do surveys, they tend to also be anonymized as well, right? So there are those differences. Okay, so this is where I pause on the comparisons and the paradigm. So now we're going to zoom in specifically on qualitative research. So if you were to choose qualitative research, or if your study is qualitative, what are the things that you need to consider and things that you need to think about as you're conducting your research from qualitative perspectives? So qualitative research, as I've kind of alluded really in the previous slide, is that it's about meanings that people give to life, to the environment. It's about the lived experiences. It's about the perceptions that people have about the world, about a particular issue. And what it's interested in the complexities of identity, right? So it's not just saying, okay, what is your experience of this? What is your experience of that? But you want to understand and dig deeper to look at the complex ways in which people make meaning of the world. As I listen to you in the interview, as you are in conversation with your participant, you're also listening for the contradictions that are there. You're also listening to the multiplicity, the different ways in which people come to make sense of their lives, how they refer to the past, how they imagine the future, and what are some of the contradictions as well. So it also becomes very important, even how you carve your research questions. There really is a strategy to also how you put together your interview schedule. That question 1 has to lead to and speak to question 2, to question 3, to question 4. How is question 10 in your interview schedule also speaking to what you said in question 1? So that thread and the interconnections have to be there. So there is order in the interview schedule that you're putting together. That's why it's also very important that you engage and you discuss with your supervisor. And that's why we need to see your research, your interview schedule as the supervisor to also see the alignment with your objectives, alignment with the research questions that you're asking, right? But also, as you are interested in the complexities of people's lives, you're also interested in the contradictions that are there, right? That while a person prefers this, at the same time, they're also saying this, right? So how do you reconcile these things? How do you make meaning of these things as a researcher when it comes to your interpretation and meaning making? So the nuances that are there, the silences, the body languages, how people construct or form identities that they then present to the world is very important. And also, of course, the politics of identity, because how people engage with the world, come into the world, all of that is linked to also how they construct their own reality, right? How they identify with the outside world and what are the politics of that, right? So it's really about exploring the social and cultural world that is around us and how all of that give meaning to how we then make sense of the world. Qualitative research views the subject or the world in a particular way, right? So you, as a qualitative researcher, you need to ask yourself a number of questions. What is it exactly that you think you can do as a researcher, right? Can you investigate? Can you be able to interpret meaning in a way that assists us to understand phenomena in a way that we did not understand it before? And what do we assume when we focus on people's experiences, on people's perspective of the world, on people's point of view? So how do we then make assumptions immediately? So we are assuming that people know or can interpret the world better because they've lived it, because they've experienced the world, because they've experienced a particular phenomena, right? So if you're saying you're interested in the experiences of people who have been living with HIV, right? So you come with assumptions that people who are living with HIV have got a particular way in which they see the world. They've got a particular way in which they move in the world. So that is already an assumption that you're making. And when you come with that assumption, you are therefore coming with the intention or the hope that these experiences or perspectives that people have about HIV, about living with HIV, are going to provide us a different kind of meaning or understanding that someone who is not living with HIV would, right? Because the question is, there are people who also know about HIV. There are people who have got knowledge about HIV. Why don't you interview doctors or nurses or people who've got loved ones or people in their lives that live with HIV, but you're saying you're interested in people who are living with HIV, which means there's a specific thing that you are interested in. There's a specific perspective that you are assuming that this individual will be able to provide, right? So when we say justify the choices that you're making, why this particular group of people, you need to be able to think in broadly in these particular ways in terms of the assumptions that you're making. But at the end of the day, it is really about experience, right? You are saying as a qualitative researcher that people who have got experience of a particular phenomena have got the authority to be able to speak or provide information or guidance or insights on that particular phenomena, right? So partners of people who are living with HIV and maybe they don't have it, for example. So what is it like? What is your experience of being this person that is in this particular situation, particular condition? So you therefore say that there is an authority that people have when they have a particular experience. And what is that experience? Is it a pure experience, as in it is as one sees it, as one understands it, as one have lived it? Or is it also mediated? And by mediation, I mean, is it mediated by the context? Is it mediated by other factors in their lives? Or can we assume that people's experiences are pure? Or does your history define who you are? Does your culture define who you are? So these are some of the questions then that you need to ask yourself as a researcher. And so the question again, when we go back to ontology and epistemology, are you interested in the truth, or are you interested in retelling in a way that is going to offer us understanding of a particular phenomenon? What was it like, as a research question or a question in an interview, what was it like growing up in apartheid South Africa? So I might not know what it was like, as perhaps I did not grow up during the heart of apartheid, during the serious oppression that people experienced under apartheid, right? So I'm interested in knowing what must it have been like to have to carry a dompas or to carry a passport to move to another part of the country that had been demarcated as not belonging to the country, right? So you're interested in the narration of that. You're interested in someone who lived through that period and who's got experience of what it was like. So is their account true? Or are you interested in understanding some of the experiences that people went through during that time? So it's the retelling from the teller's perspective, but through that retelling, we can get an understanding of what apartheid's impact is or has been on people's lives. Can I understand apartheid and its impact based on me having interviews with people, right? So that the importance of the retelling. And is that retelling supposed to mean that the story is true, or is true as people understand it and is based on their experience, right? So qualitative research terminology in a nutshell. We have been alluding to some of these things, talking about sampling, talking about the participants that you're going to interview, for example. So there's interviews that you will conduct supposedly, right? It's one of the ways. But some of the terminology that we would use in qualitative research is sampling. And sampling really could be purposeful, or which means it's non-random, because often random sampling we would use in quantitative research. So it's non-random in that it's very specific. You are interested in people who grew up during apartheid. So obviously you're not just going to go and interview anyone. You're not going to go and interview someone who's 25 years old or who's 30 years old, because that person did not grow up during apartheid. So you're very purposeful in whom you choose. You're choosing people who are going to be able to provide you with the kind of information that you need so that you're able to answer your research question. And also, you can use snowball sampling, again, as an example. And snowball, again, and I'll get to elaborating on this also a little bit. So this is really just in a nutshell. And in terms of quality, because again, part of the what was assumed to be the weakness of qualitative research was that, but how do you quality control qualitative research? Because with other kinds of research or with quantitative, it's easy because you've got, you can test and you can measure the validity of the study, right? In very predetermined ways. And so it really required qualitative research to also think about ways in which we can look at the quality of the research that you're conducting. We're living in the moment again now of AI. And so we, but also you, are really confronted again, I think, with different sets of challenges. Right? So each moment and each period in life, in time, provides us or it brings us various forms of complexities. So when qualitative research started as a methodology that was acknowledged, that was also centered as a legitimate form of conducting scientific research, these were some of the questions that came up. And scholars, of course, then came up with ways in which we can look at how to quality control qualitative research. And that's why we now have ways in which you can be able to say, this is how you're going to determine trustworthiness of the data that you've collected. Yeah? Again, I'm speaking and I'm saying now we're in the period of AI. Is there maybe perhaps a need to rethink the trustworthiness of the data that we collect? So trustworthiness, this is the times before AI. Credibility, is the work dependable, and can it be confirmed, confirmability and transferability? Can I go and conduct a similar study somewhere else, following from reading your study, reading your work? And again, when it comes to the data and the quality of the data and how we come with the data, it's also about the process of conducting the research. The themes, as we know, tend to be emergent, right? And there's reflexibility that is needed there, because remember, you as the researcher are an instrument in the research, and therefore you cannot really divorce yourself from the research. So there is some level of subjectivity that you bring into the research. How do you do it in such a way that does not negatively influence your data? The audience, is it very clear with the audience of your study are? And then representation of the data, rich descriptions, the codes, the extracts. We need to know that you actually did this work, right? And so just a little bit, I've already explained sampling. We've got convenience sampling, we've got purposive sampling, and here it's really about who is available that is relevant for your research. Sometimes we do this because, again, of costs. Are you going to go and conduct research? Your research is interested in the experiences of the Vavenda people, right, on a particular phenomenon. And you're going to look within Gauteng whether you can get a sample of Vavenda people, or you maybe the specific thing or a specific ritual that you're interested in, which might require you to actually take a trip and go to Venda. Do you have funds for that? So it's again about accessibility. It's about research that allows you to get access to the population or participants that you need. So it's convenient. So you'll say you've done convenience or convenience sampling. But also there's the issue of the purpose, where it's purposive because you're interested in specific things or specific people, right? And then Snowball, I've also said it, it's another form of convenience sampling where you make initial contact with a group of people, but then maybe you do not have contacts, you do not know many people who fall within that population that you're interested in. And if you can get access to one person or two people, they can perhaps introduce you to other people as well. Because depending on the focus of your study, certain communities tend to know each other. And now, because we are in the 4IR moment or world, it even becomes easier also because of social media. Sometimes people form communities and they have social media groups, or people belong to a WhatsApp group that is about a particular issue, mothers of autistic children, for example, and then maybe they have a WhatsApp group where they provide support and resources to one another. So if you know one mother, she can introduce you to the rest of the group, right? So that's how snowballing would then take place. So going back again, as I said, to quality control in qualitative research, scholars, and one of the leading scholars in coming up about with saying, how do we do quality control in qualitative research, Cavale, because again, in the beginning, there was almost this wanting to force quality control using quantitative tools, but within qualitative research, which made it very difficult, as you can imagine. So within quantitative research, as we know, we have what we call the holy trinity of science. If it's not reliable, if you cannot measure reliability, or if you cannot tell us or show the validity, or if it's not generalizable, then we cannot say that it's scientific. We cannot say that it is facts in terms of conducting research. And now, to legitimize quantitative research, at some point there was this need to say, how do we do it? Can we speak about reliability in the way that it's spoken about within quantitative research? And Cavale argues that no, actually we can't. We need to think of other ways in which we can still determine quality in qualitative research, but not relying on the Holy Trinity. And here we need to check whether the work is credible. You're not going to come with fabricated data and say you conducted research when you didn't. And the work has to also be transferable. Can I take the steps that you followed in how you've thoroughly explained it in your thesis or your article and replicate, if you will, in inverted commas, a similar study in a different community, in a different context with different people, but following on how the steps that you followed in your own research. Is it transferable, right? And is it confirmability also, and is it dependable? That's also very important. Can I depend on this data? And can I confirm this data? And this is where, again, you're going to say, okay, I checked the data and I had somebody else check the data. I used this form of coding or data analysis, and then I did it again in this particular way. So how do you confirm the data? But also you can confirm the data by going back to the people that you interviewed. Confirmability of the data means coming back to me and saying, am I representing what you said to me correctly? So that's also very important because sometimes we mishear people. So a person says something, but maybe they meant something else, or they meant it differently than you understood it. So you're going to work with the raw data, but when you make meaning and interpret based on the data that you've used, you need to go back to the community or to the people that you've interviewed, that you've done focus groups with, that you use as case studies, and say, is this a true representation of what you were saying in our interview? And that's one of the ways in which you can confirm your data. And then we can say it's dependable as well. Okay. And then trust, how do we establish trust? Again, there it's just really unpacking what I've just said. Prolonged engagement, you're not going to go and do a 5-minute interview and then say to us that, you have, so the data has to be rich, right? And then you check the credibility by also peer debriefing. You check with your colleagues, but now when you're doing your research as a master's or doctoral student, we're expecting you to really be the leader in the research that you're doing. We're expecting you to check and do the check and balances yourself alongside your supervisor. So we can say, or we can't say your supervisor is your peer. Also checking, and that's why I mean, as supervisors, we would also require to see the transcripts, so that even as you work on your analysis and make interpretations, we need to check that this is really true in terms of what you're saying you did, right? And then member checking also, using confirmability and credibility interchangeably, apologies, where you also then check with those that you collected the data with, right? And then transferability, the thick descriptions, you describe it in a way that I can go and do it elsewhere. Is there an audit trail? Is there raw data available? Are there notes that you've put together? So if we say we want evidence that you've collected this data, you need to make that available to us. And those are some of the ways that we can control for quality in the research. So I'm just going to quickly go through a few research designs, maybe for the next 10 to 15 minutes, after which then I can open up for us to have a conversation to see if you have any questions where you seek clarity. And then when you're done, then you can be able to close off for the day, and then we will continue again tomorrow. So I also want us to have time to have a discussion. So in qualitative research, there's quite a number of research designs that are available. And oftentimes we zoom in on one or two research designs. And I think it's important to have an idea of an array of research designs that we can tap into. Again, depending on the focus of your study, what would make sense for you? What would be meaningful for you when you're doing or you're conducting your research? And I'd like us to just go through briefly each of these research designs and see where we end up, and then we can also continue tomorrow. But one of the research designs that we have in qualitative research is grounded theory. And grounded theory originated, as you can see, in the 60s with Glaser and Strauss, who were from the discipline of psychology, but this is applicable in the social sciences more broadly. And here I'm even speaking to the social sciences broadly, not just in the humanities, but also economic and management sciences, your law, when you're thinking about how you gather your data and what you do with your data. Because I think oftentimes we're used to collecting all the data, doing all the 20 or 30 interviews, and then sitting with the data to now look at how do we code, how do we make meaning of the data. But Gleiser and Strauss say that theory generation can start even at the very beginning of conducting or collecting your data. And here the difference again here is that your interest is that you would like to generate a theory. So you have your theoretical framework, you have a theory that you're using in your research, but you're also saying that you would like to develop a theory of this or the other in your research. And for you to do this, they argue that it's about logical deduction. You start deducing from the onset. And what this means is that there can be some reformulation and reshaping of the questions that you are asking based on the responses that you are already receiving from your participants as you start collecting your data. So there's a need for a broad theory or explanation of a particular process, and you are arguing that you've looked at the current theories. So there are a number of frameworks that you looked at, but you find that the theories that are there are inadequate. Or you are arguing that there is no theory that can be used to be able to make sense of this particular phenomena that you are investigating. And as you can imagine, obviously, you need to provide a compelling argument to me as your supervisor to say to me, there is no theory. This is the topic I'm interested in. And this is the objective, or these are the objectives. These are the questions that I'm asking. And as I'm doing so, and as I'm reading or as I've read the literature, I cannot seem to find a theory that I can use as a lens to be able to do this research that I'm doing. Because remember, your theoretical framework is also very important and very integral in your data collection, in how you're going to approach the process of your methodology, right? So if, for example, we use the example of gender-based violence, right? And you're saying there's high rates of gender-based violence in South Africa, which is a fact. And so I'm interested in the experiences of women who've survived gender-based violence, right? What have they done? What did they do? What support did they get? What are the challenges that are contributing towards gender-based violence in South Africa? And when that is your focus, when that is the research that you want to conduct, you cannot come to me as a supervisor and say, no, Prof, I've checked the theories. I cannot find a theory that I can use as a lens to be able to engage with this phenomena. That cannot be. So there are theories that exist. There's feminist theories that are in abundance, and you just need to look at which feminist theory speaks to how you want to approach your study, right? That theory, how is that theory informing the ways in which you're going to approach your study? Are you going to use womanism? Are you going to use Black feminism? Are you going to use African feminism? Are you going to just use radical feminism? So what feminist perspective are you going to draw from? Because that feminist perspective is going to determine how you're going to approach your research, right? If you're saying you're using African feminism, then I'm already expecting that in your methodology, I'm going to see or hear things about African traditions or African culture and how all of those influence or play a role in the experiences of women in their communities or gender-based violence. Is socialization, is patriarchy within the African context, access for women to particular resources or inheritance and things like that. So already your theoretical framework gives me an idea of how your research methodology and the focus of your study is going to go about. Because based on that, you're going to come back and say, no, but African feminism is actually insufficient in assisting us to do these particular things, right? And this actually is how many of these theories came about, right? Where you had your radical feminism, for example, that just said, you know, hey, women want rights, women are not interested in having babies, women want, you know, the workforce and enter and do things. And then you have African women who then come and say, but this theory is not sufficient in explaining experiences of African women. And therefore, while as a starting point, we can say it is a theory that speaks to the subjugation of women, how it then goes about in terms of saying what needs to happen is insufficient. It does not speak to our reality or our context. And therefore, we need a different kind of theory that is going to take into consideration the context, the culture, the history of African people, of African women. And therefore, we suggest African feminism, right? And then it comes to life as a theory that other people can now use if they're interested in the experiences from an African perspective. Right? So do you see how theories come to life, how theories come to be, how theories get developed? So in that case, you can say there's a theory or there are theories, but they're inadequate. And as you build, as you engage with women in the African context, embedded in African cultures, as you engage with them, there are things that you start pulling out. And this is how theory, then you start generating a theory. So as the codes, as the themes appear, as you start collecting, you are immediately also analyzing at the same time. And you're starting to generate a theory, right? And so you're saying that which exists is insufficient. And if you were doing another study altogether, I can't think of an example immediately, where you say, I've looked at a number of theories, and all of these theories do not at all provide me a lens that I can use for the research that I want to do. Then you can argue that a theory is non-existent as it relates to the topic or the research that you want to conduct. And this is what Glaser and Strauss are saying to us, that this is a theory that is developed from the ground. So you're developing a theory based on the engagements that you're having with your participants immediately. Okay. So Constant comparative analysis is another way in which you can think about your research. And what this does is you capitalize on the ways in which people naturally think about the world, about things. We want to think early about interpretation and theory. And when you start doing that, then you're starting to generate the theory, as I said. So you are immediately comparing. So you start with participant 1. Okay, what am I hearing? What am I seeing? You start underlining, you start saying, okay. You put it into Atlas TI, maybe if you're using a software, and you start seeing what codes are coming, you put those together. And you say, okay, let me do another interview and then let me see what comes up. You do another interview and then you put these interviews next to each other and you're saying, okay, what am I hearing? What is now starting to emerge, right? And then based on that, you already start making interpretations, saying, oh, okay, these are the things that I'm already seeing. Let me put them together. These are the things that I'm seeing. Let me put them together. And what happens in that moment is that you're not already using a particular predetermined lens for you to start making meaning of these codes or of this data. Whereas if you've got a theory, you are using that theory to assist you to make sense of the data. That's why even in your analysis, your interpretation, your discussion, we want to see that theory again emerging that you used or you introduced to us in the earlier chapters before your methodology chapter. Whether it was part of your literature chapter or a standalone theory framework chapter, you are now bringing in after you've now collected the data with a grounded theory. That's not how it would work, right? So Shamaz says grounded theory methods consist of simultaneous data collection and data analysis, as I've just said, with each one informing and focusing the other throughout the research process. So what you have asked participant 1 might be different from what you're going to ask participant 3 or participant 5, because one is informing the other. Okay, this is what's coming up. This is what I'm seeing. This is maybe the kind of pattern or themes that are emerging. So how do I then elaborate or build on that? What questions are arising for you? And then those will inform how you reformulate and how you're going to ask the questions to participant 3, participant 4, and 5, right? And one would say, but Prof, when we apply for ethics clearance, we need to already have an ethics schedule, or rather a data collection schedule. But remember, if you've already indicated that you're doing grounded theory, which one of my students actually is, it's quite a tricky process. But if that's the kind of direction that you want to go, because you believe that your work can actually come up with a new theory of understanding something, then that's something that we do. So you do need questions, obviously, because what are you going to ask the first person? So that is your interview schedule that you're going to be using. And then with the understanding, obviously the ethics committee as researchers themselves, if they read and they see you using grounded theory, they already know that there's going to be shifts along the way. So it's not really a very easy design to follow, but it is important because we need rethinking and reimagining of the theories that we're using. How we develop theory, how we come up with new knowledge requires us to step out of our comfort zones quite a bit. So that's also very important. Okay. I'm just going to finish off with grounded theory, and then I'm going to stop there and have discussions, and then we'll discuss the rest tomorrow. And maybe I'll move faster because I think many of them you'll be familiar with, I hope. So when you're doing grounded theory, you don't want to be influenced by already existing theories, right? So when you do when you've decided that you're doing grounded theory, you ignore existing theories, and you are arguing that there is little or no literature that exists. And as I've said, you collect, you code, you analyze concurrently. And it's not deductive, but very much inductive in many ways. So it's bottom up. You're moving from the specific to the general. So you're moving from one interview, another. So you're moving from the specific, the initial codes, and then you're moving to the end where you've got all these codes and putting everything together, where you can now generalize, if you will, where you can say these are the themes that I've come up with, but based on the initial work that you would have done inductively at the beginning. It's very systematic. And you know, it's an exhaustive comparison of text segments. And because you've got things like Atlas TI, it might be a bit easier because you already have the code set up for you by the software, which you obviously need to work with and make meaning of and analyze and interpret, right? It just really gives you, it does the labor of having to come up with codes. So it does that for you. And then you can build a thematic structure. And when you've built a thematic structure, then you are able to come up with a theory. So this is kind of step by step on how one develops a theory according to Glaser and Strauss, right? So that's one of the ways in which one can do it. And as scholars, as researchers, we read each other's work, we engage with each other's work, and even as you decide on what research design you're going to use, it's very important for you to know what the advantages are, but also what the criticism is or have been of a particular way of doing research. So Thomas and James made an argument in 2006 saying that it is impossible to free yourself of preconceptions in the collection and analysis of data in the way that Glaser and Strauss say is necessary. Because they say that you need to not be influenced by any existing theory. You need to not be influenced by literature, because the reason why when you're doing research, you're doing literature review, and you're doing a theoretical framework is so that they can inform your work. So Thomas and James argue that these are very important to be able to inform the work that you're doing. And Glaser and Strauss were kind of saying, or are saying, try as much as possible to work from a clean slate, because when you do that, it affords you the space to generate and to produce from a position that is not already influenced. Right, so that is what grounded theory is about, and you'll see when we move to other forms of designing your study, they're quite different than grounded theory. It's often the one that is kind of an outlier, not often used. I think very rarely will we find students that choose to use grounded theory. I'm having one of my PhD students using grounded theory, and it's very tricky in terms of how you navigate between these different spaces. But I think it's also a challenge that if maybe one is willing to take up, that you should. You know, so I'm going to pause here for tonight and then come back to you. So that we can have a conversation. Okay. So I'm interested in the comments that you might be having based on today's lecture, but also the questions that you might be having. Okay. All right. I see earlier on, I'm not sure. I think there was a point, and I apologize. There was a point, I think, where my slides were not moving, or you could not see the slides but I hope that that issue was resolved in time so that you're still able to follow the session. If there are anything or if there's anything that you might have missed, please let me know. Luckily, the sessions will continue for the next 2 days. So whatever might have been missed, we can continue with that as well. Because I see a question here. Someone was asking when we had already started with the session, whether the session had been postponed. So I do apologize for that technical glitch. It happens sometimes. Sometimes it does happen. Is it possible to combine social constructivism and critical participatory in the same study, or one has to stick to a single paradigm? Anonymous, yes, you can combine. Like I said, it depends. What is the focus of your study? What is it that you want to look at? So maybe you are interested in how people construct reality in a particular way. So you're interested in a particular phenomena, and you're interested in the social construction of whatever issue that a person or people are going through. But at the same time, you also want to move deeper than just understanding the social construction, but to also dig deep and say, what are some of the layers or the issues that influence the ways in which people construct their reality, construct the world around them. And so their history, their economy, right? And maybe you're interested in saying, how do I then move towards an emancipatory way in which people can envisage the world going forward? So that example that I was giving earlier about LGBTIQ, right? So how do people construct their reality? How do people come into the world? How do people understand the world? There's often an argument around how gender is a social construct, right? How we come into the world and perform our identities in the world is constructed and is influenced by the environments that we're finding ourselves in. So that's how we construct the world and how we construct our identities. And so sometimes the way in which we construct the world or our realities can be restricted by the environment that we're finding ourselves in. And as a result, you want to critique that environment. You want to critique that status quo and say, but don't women have rights and autonomy to their body, or shouldn't they have rights and autonomy to their bodies? And therefore, there has to be an emancipatory way, or there has to be a rethinking, a critique of the ways in which reality is currently constructed. And this is where the critical emancipatory paradigm comes in. So you can bring them into conversation or use them alongside one another. But you need to articulate that and make that argument in your study. But if you're just interested in the idea of the construction of the world, of identity, of realities, and then look at how people make meaning of that and how they move in the world as a result of that, then you stop there. Then that's also okay. But if you're saying, I also want to go further, then you are most definitely also able to do that. But you need to be able to articulate that, and your research objectives also need to speak to that as well. Okay, so it's a similar question around, can I use qualitative and quantitative in my research, for example? Again, absolutely, you can use qualitative and quantitative, but should you, based on the research question that you've put before me, I don't see why you should do both, because your question is interested in this and that. And based on this question, this is what would make sense in terms of how you go about doing your research. So I think it's very, very important, as I was saying, that paradigms are determined by the epistemology and the ontologies. And those are the ones then that will then determine whether you marry different paradigms or you don't. I hope that answers your question, Anonymous. So the quick answer really is yes, you can. Okay, Ntabiseng, thank you for your comment on your own theoretical framework and how you're thinking about it. Hello, Rebecca. Would critical paradigm be more suited for language research and comparison of published work? Yes, you would. It would not necessarily be more suited. It would be suited. It can be applicable if you're interested in language research. So maybe if you are in languages, absolutely, because you're interested in analyzing, all right, language and the way it's used and how meanings are formed. And I'm even thinking of discourse analysis, for example. So if you are in languages and interested in the discourses, so are you interested in the stories that are being told in the published work, or are you interested in how language is used? And you're analyzing language in published works. Absolutely. So critical paradigm would definitely be very suited there. And if, for example, maybe using a discourse analysis, how is the person using language? You'll see tomorrow. Again, when we look at these paradigms and how they link to the research design, how your question will be answered even more there again, because I think there's somewhere where I also use an example, like for example so it could be published work in terms of academic published works, but it could also be published works in terms of newspapers. You know, when you look at newspapers and you analyze how language is used to get people's emotions into what is being said, or to provoke people in a particular way in how language is used. So all of those things are very much integral to the kind of paradigm that you use as well. So the critical paradigm would definitely, I think, be very suited, because often we don't think beyond what is in front of us in terms of the language, in terms of the sentence. And then it forces us to move beyond the sentence, but to also look at other layers and underlying meanings of what is being said. And that's why discourse analysis also is such a brilliant way to do the kind of work that you are doing, Rebecca, in languages. Ramadimeja, you're saying when you hear of research jargon, you feel like you get a mental block. I apologize. It's just that, you know, in research, I'm sorry, I just need to charge my laptop. In research, when we are using these jargons, it's just really just conforming and going with the academic language and languaging that we use in academia, and sometimes, yeah, it's really just following the status quo. I'm not sure how one could do it differently. Someone once asked, why don't you just say how people come to know, or come to, yes, how people come to know the world and how the knowledge is produced and what counts as knowledge. Because when you say epistemology, it's like you're talking about something out there, but when you say epistemology, it's really about knowledge, about producing knowledge, about what counts as knowledge, and that's what epistemology is about. And yes, perhaps sometimes we should move towards that level. But for now, I think maybe just trying to balance is also very important, that you don't just use the jargon without also going and explaining what they mean. Okay. Hi, Anonymous. You alluded to sample size briefly. Is there a formula for determining acceptable sample size in qualitative research? No. I know that different scholars provide different ranges, 6 to 5, etc. How do I therefore determine that 10, for example, is the suitable sample size? The issue again, the issue of sample size, Anonymous, is a very tricky one, particularly because you're often asked at the beginning how many people you're going to interview, and you need that for your proposal, you need that for your research ethics application, because ideally you want to go and engage with people, and it can be determined by cost. Can you afford to interview 20 people? Can you afford to interview 50 people? Are they easily accessible, right? So if maybe you are doing a very interesting study on an underground community, or community that is, when they say there's, or some, the dark side of things, it might be difficult, and maybe snowballing could work, but it might not work because some of those societies rely or depend on anonymity and confidentiality, secrecy and trust. So I cannot give you the name of another person that belongs to that secret society. Sometimes you're working in a or with a population that does not have a lot of people, right? So if you're going to say you're interested in interviewing women astronauts in South Africa, how many women astronauts do we have in South Africa, right? So again, your study is going to again determine some of these things, the focus of your study. If maybe it's a study you're interested in, as the example I used earlier, of gender-based violence and experiences of women who've experienced gender-based violence, sadly, a very sad reality that the pool could be quite big. There are women in shelters, there are women who go for healthcare access as a result of abuse. There are women in our communities that we know, that we might approach. So the pool might be bigger. So again, it depends. It depends on the focus of your study. And for now, what we are using is what literature is suggesting. And as you say, literature says, between 6 and 15, and again, depending on which literature or which source you're using, some go as big as 20. So it really depends. And sometimes you're interested in autoethnography study. I've seen PhDs, particularly in psychology, psychobiographies of people. So you write your whole 250 pages of a PhD thesis just with one participant, because you're interested in psychobiography. So again, the focus of your study will determine this. And I'm very reluctant to give a number, and rather say it has to really be determined by the focus of your study. You can say a minimum of so many people, and that you are anticipating. Remember, when you're writing a proposal, or when you are applying for ethics, you are anticipating something that is not as yet. So you can look at what you think is feasible for you, depending on the community where you want to go, people you want to, and then determine on a number based on what literature is saying. You might end up, instead of 6, and end up with 3 people, but then it's rich data, and you're able to indicate why that is. Because remember, with qualitative, it's not about generalization, right? Or you might end up with 30 people. Sometimes you go to a community or you start engaging with people, and then they say, no, so-and-so could benefit so much from this kind of conversation, this interview, can I tell so-and-so, can you contact so-and-so? And again, obviously that goes with issues of confidentiality and all of that. But if a person is willing to have their names mentioned and they say, I would like to check with other people, or I think so-and-so could be available, or some of our communities in the rural areas might actually determine for you. You go into a community and you say, I'm interested in this phenomena. I've come to the community. I'm asking for access to the community. May I please? And then the leaders of the community can say, yes, we're going to bring all these people. We think it's important for you to engage with all these people. And that is the condition of you getting access to the community. So sometimes you might be thinking you're going to do individual interviews. You might end up with also focus groups. Obviously, you need to go back to a supervisor. You need to go check whether in terms of the approval that you got, whether it's still within, or you can request for an adjustment, because the university does make room for adjustment as long as it's not shifting the focus of the study which was given permission, right? If it's swerving way too much in the opposite direction, then you might need to reapply for ethical clearance. Anonymous, I know I'm not giving you a straight answer. That's because there is no straight answer. I think it's very different when you're doing qualitative research. As we're saying, it's very much things as they emerge. It's very emergent in its nature, and to restrict it to specific numbers kinds of makes it difficult for qualitative research to actually accomplish what it needs to accomplish. But as a starting point, and should there be a specific number that you need to provide, I would encourage you to use existing literature as a guide and say you'll use so many people as suggested, or as recommended by literature, as so and so and so and so says, right? And sometimes so-and-so could be based in a different context altogether, another part of the world. And as I say here, if you go to a community, the community leaders can say they want it to be done differently. Okay, so I'm really encouraging you to be open to what you might encounter when you actually go and conduct the research. How many theoretical frameworks should a researcher have in qualitative research? Frank, there is no determined number, right? So if you're doing your master's research, you must have a theoretical framework. And it's okay for you to just have one theoretical framework for your master's, right? You can push it to 2 if you want, but in terms of the official requirements of what one would expect within a master's study, because there you with a master's study, you are showing us you are able to conduct a scientific study, right? So one theoretical framework is acceptable. When you're conducting a PhD study, ideally, a minimum of 2 theoretical frameworks is advised. So this is not a rule that is set on stone, right? Again, it's going to depend whether there are theories or there are many theories that are aligned to your study. So we often recommend that you at least have 2 theories at PhD level, because at PhD level, we now want to start hearing your voice more. We want to see that you are able to make considerable contribution to knowledge production. We want to see that you can really immerse yourself and be in conversation with existing scholars in what they've come up with. So when you marry 2 theoretical frameworks together, and you can even bring in 3 or 4 theoretical frameworks, but you need to convince me as the supervisor that all of these theories are necessary. You need to show that all of these theories are necessary for your research, and you have to show how they build on each other, and you have to show how the second theory and the third theory are doing what the first theory is not doing. So here's the theory speaking about this particular issue using this lens. It's very useful, but it's not touching on everything that you would like to also focus on. And so you're bringing this other theory alongside this theory, right? So you're interested in issues of women, their psychological well-being, and the experiences of gender-based violence. Somewhere, perhaps, I'm interested in seeing some feminist theory, a feminist theory. And I'm also interested, maybe if you're in psychology, to say what is the psychological framing in terms of people who've experienced violence one could draw from, right? So you bring in the psychological lens, and then maybe you're also bringing another theory as well, depending on what your objectives are. You look at your objectives and then you say, is this theory attending to my 5 objectives? Is this theory attending to my 5 research questions? And so that should then assist you and inform you in terms of the theoretical framework that you will be using. So as I said, in a nutshell, for a master's, one theoretical framework is acceptable, is okay. For a PhD, we really recommend that you use 2 theories or even 3 theories. I've seen studies or students who've actually drawn from 4 theories. And as I said, if you provide a compelling argument that why all of these are needed and important, then by all means. Can we use a transcriber to transcribe while we conduct the interview? Yes, Darlene, you can use a transcriber. Remember, even when you apply for funding, whether a bursary at UNISA or external bursaries or scholarships, you can even, you can even budget for it. So you can get somebody to transcribe, but you need to do the analysis. It's very important. So you conduct the research, because in the conducting of the research, there are nuances that I spoke about earlier that are very important. And for you to be able to lay claim to this study, you need to have conducted the study. So you need to conduct that study, and then if it needs to be translated, you can get a translator, you can get it translated, you can get it transcribed, but you need to sit with the transcription and work on the transcription. Remember what Atlas TI, for example, does. It pretty much transcribes for you in many ways, and it puts codes for you that you can work with. That is allowed. What is very important is that you need to analyze the data yourself. You need to interpret the data yourself. So whether in qualitative or in quantitative, you can use SPSS, you can get a statistician to run the data for you, but you need to still sit with that data and analyze that data, interpret that data, and then come to conclusions. Only then can you claim that that study is yours, right? So Darlene, yes. Who approves all the theories? Your supervisor. So this is a conversation that you'll have because you are, remember, you need to decide what theory you're going to use. The supervisor, reading your proposal can also suggest, right? They can suggest and indicate why they're suggesting for you to consider a particular theory. Now that your study is focusing on this and that, have you considered maybe this particular theories? Go and read on it, or here are other 2 possible theories. go and read on them and see if maybe you might want to include them in your study. So ideally, a supervisor should not enforce a theory. They should not say you must use this theory. That is a little bit problematic because you need to identify a theory or identify theories. And then your supervisor, yes, has to approve that theory or those theories. So who approves the theories? Your supervisor, because that is the person that you're working with in your research. Okay, so it's always a process of negotiation, engagement, because remember, you're on this journey together. Your supervisor is there to guide you. They're not there to instruct you. They're there to guide you. And you know, to show you different ways in which you can look at something, that what you might want to consider. But at the end of the day, it's your journey and it has to still be your study at the end of the day. We don't want you to have a thesis at the end and then you say, I never even wanted to use that theory. My supervisor forced me to use that theory. I don't think that's the kind of experience that we would like our students to have. Okay. Applying for ethical clearance. When do you apply? You apply for ethical clearance only after you are done with your proposal and your proposal has been passed. Because when you apply for ethical clearance, the ethical clearance, the ethics committee is going to request for proof of proposal acceptance. So that's the only time that you can start applying for your ethical clearance. Okay, you can start engaging and talking about it with your supervisor, or after you've submitted your proposal to the higher degrees committee, you can kind of start working on your ethical clearance because there is a form, so you can start completing that form. But some things might change depending on the feedback that you get from higher degrees committee and what you need to revise. So that's why you might want to put that on hold a bit. You can put in details that are straightforward that need to be on the form. But it has to be when you are done with your proposal because it's a requirement. It's a requirement. Okay. Hi, Jabu. What would the relevant paradigm be if I'm exploring challenges in implementing effective performance management in the workplace? Jabu, we would need to have a conversation because I need to know exactly what you want to ask and what. So you're exploring the challenges. So you want to know what the challenges are of implementing performance management. So performance management is there, but the implementing of it, there are some challenges. So what could some of those issues be? And again, there you can consider the constructivist could be relevant because implementation could also be based on some of the, or challenges around implementations could be based on some of the things that people might be disagreeing with. It could be people feeling things being imposed on them. It could be, so there are many issues. So what is it that you are interested in finding out? So you would need to break it down for me. But social constructivism could be relevant. Interpretivist could be relevant because you're interested in how people interpret these performance management processes. And based on how they interpret them, then you might find the underlying layers of why there are challenges as a result. So how do people make meaning of them? How do people make sense of them? What is it that they think is an issue with them? What is it that they think could be done differently? And what is it that they think are the challenges? I think I've already said that. And then based on that, so how do people interpret these processes, right? Would determine why they are seeing challenges with them, right? But you can also use a critical paradigm where you say, these are also imposed. It's about power struggles and power imbalances that people feel that they were not consulted, that they do not see themselves in these performance management processes, and therefore they then rebel against them, right? So then it offers an opportunity for a critical review or a critical lens to look at the understanding and meaning that people give to performance management processes. I hope that helps. That is just me based on the one sentence that you put there. Okay. I find it difficult to align this jargon with my topic. Dear student, please tell me what your topic is. And yes, you are more than welcome also, and this is to everybody, you are more than welcome to send me an email outside of class if you would like. So you can share the topic here, but because we always don't have enough time, I'm open to you sending me an email if you would like. Can you change a theory in the middle of the study if you realize that the one you chose is not working for your data? Abigail. You can't do that. Instead, you can say that part of the reason is also to say this data shows that this theory is actually insufficient, or this theory comes short based on the data that I have. So one of the things that the theory does, as I said, it provides you a lens to look at your data, to work with your data. But when you are working, it's almost as if one says, okay, this literature is not aligned to my study. The literature assists you to start thinking about how you would like to approach your study, to find the gaps and to see what direction to follow. The theory also does similar, but it's a lens in terms of how specifically you approach your research, collecting the data, and then how you make meaning of the data. So when you analyze your data, or when you make interpretation of your data, you might find that, oh, this data is actually not aligned necessarily with the theory that I was using. And that's part of your finding, which is wonderful, because then you are saying to us that we need to look beyond this theory. Right? It might not necessarily be grounded theory, but then it means your study is telling us that this theory has got some shortcomings, and your study is showing that we need to build on that existing theory. So Abigail, that would mean your study has really brought us an addition or something to work with going forward. And how you then coin that or you model that as part of your recommendations or your conclusions would then be up to you, so that we are able to draw from your study as well, right? Building on the theory that was existing. Your work is building on the theory. And that would be part of your conclusion, that my study, my conclusion, my study shows, or it builds on this existing theory. And it builds on it in these ways, that while this theory says this, my study shows that we also need to do this, or we actually need to do something else, right? So that would actually be a beautiful contribution. You don't have to change your theory. Okay. How long does it take to be allocated a supervisor, Ngozi? I think if you go online and goes to look at the processes of applying, because if you've applied and then all the applications with your outlines go to the department, and then depending on availability of supervisors in the department, it might take from January, depending on when you applied, it can be a month to 3 to 4 months. As the department and as the M&D office also communicates and engages with the department. But one thing that I always encourage is that if you're interested in a particular department and you are interested in a particular topic, try and look for a supervisor yourself. And what that means is that if you decided that you want to do a master's in that department or a PhD in that department, go to the website of the department, look at the possible supervisors, email the supervisor. We're happy to receive your emails. That's how I've gotten many of my students. You send me an email and you say, Prof, I saw your profile, and here's the topic that I'm interested in. I think it aligns with your research interest areas. That's why we put them on the website, so that you can see them. And based on that, I was wondering whether you would consider being my supervisor. You have not been accepted by UNISA yet. You have not, been allocated anything. And if the person says, yes, no, I would be willing to, then when you apply, there is a space that asks, have you identified a supervisor? Have you spoken? Then you put my name there. And that makes the process much quicker for you. Because what tends to happen is, if there's no supervisor already linked to your name, then you are at the mercy of supervisors in that department being available to supervise you. And sometimes people have already reached their capacity. Maybe there are 5 students who've already contacted me to say they would like me to supervise them. I've said yes. So by the time a list of just students looking for supervisors being brought to us in the department saying, here are students interested, are there any of you who are available? And maybe I've already reached my quota. So even if maybe your study might be relevant for me, I might not be able to take you on. So also that process of how you go about doing it is very important. So like I said, depending on when you've submitted your application or your request, it depends. It can take a month, it can take 3 months. It might take a month because maybe when the invite is sent to the department, I quickly say, yes, I'm interested in that student. Then the process starts immediately, right? And for others, it might take a while. It might take 2 months if there's nobody to supervise you. And then you get allocated according to people's allocations that they're given in the department. That might happen later. Okay, so there's no clear answer to that, Ngozi, and it differs really per department, per college as well. So it's not an easy one. Okay. Ntabisang, I think my email address, the colleagues who are coordinating putting together the session can provide that for you, but I've also just put it on the chat as well. Puleng Sagalo, when you go to the UNISA website, you can find my name together with the email address there as well. Okay, everybody, I think we're going to pause. We're not stopping, we're just pausing here for tonight. And we're going to continue with the session again tomorrow. But for now, enjoy the rest of your evening, and thank you for staying on 7 minutes after the time. I apologize for that. Have a good evening, everybody. Goodbye.